Stop whining, it's already sold. Those words landed on my kitchen linoleum like a dropped plate. They were not loud. Mike rarely raised his voice, but they were final, precise, and as clean as a cleaver. He was leaning against the counter, palms flat, like a man trying to look calm after breaking something that can't be mended. Ashley hovered behind him, all bright vacation pictures and the kind of smile that says recovery is already counted in the ledger. I looked down at the empty velvet box where Frank's watch used to be. The felt inside held the memory of a circle of gold and steel, the slight crescent of the clasp. There was a faint pattern where the watch had once rested. You can tell a lot from an indentation. It is where time used to live in our house. It was not the face of the watch that hurt first. It was the ritual. Frank wound it every morning while brewing his coffee. 2 slow twists, a little sigh, the tiny click that was as reliable as the morning light through the kitchen window. He did it without looking up, like he was tending to something sacred and private. His small daily liturgy. Occasionally he would let me wind it, laughing when my fingers were clumsy. "You have a way with the jewelry," he'd say. The sound of that tiny mechanism gave the house a heartbeat. Without the watch, the house felt like an improvised body missing a steady pulse. "Mike," I said. My voice did what it always does when I mean business. It gets small and cold. "You sold it?" His shoulders tightened. "We needed the money, Ma. You know bills get out of hand." He sounded like a son trying to mollify a mother. He was not in that moment the man I knew to be capable of such casual cruelty. "I know the bills," I said. "I lived with him for 42 years. I paid the bills we planned." The watch had been part of those plans in ways he didn't understand. Frank's watch was not jewelry. It was a promise. He blinked. "I gave Ashley cash for the trip. We thought we'd ask you later. Figured you'd understand." "Ask me later." The words tasted like a stranger's excuse. "You sold his watch and thought I'd understand." Ashley's smile dropped a fraction. She had used up most of her social capital already on the way in, pinning photos of villas and sunlit piazzas like passport stamps across my kitchen table. "We can find another," she offered, bright and particular, like a woman who fixes problems with new purchases. There was a time when I would have started to cry, tears that would have smoothed and then become a strange sort of fuel for action. Instead, I did what Frank taught me in other ways. I put my hand on the counter and felt the small tremor that no one else would have noticed. I catalogued the facts like a ledger. Watch, gone. Velvet box, empty. Mike, blame. Ashley, beneficiary. I left before either of them had time to prepare the next sentence. Outside, air hit my face. It was a clear day, the kind that fools you into thinking the world is straightforward. I walked to the car while my mind went to the pawn shop. Pawn shops are small cathedrals of other people's momentary emergencies. People who sell pieces of themselves because a month was expensive. People who do not understand the measures of what they are giving away. There are a dozen ways to describe a pawn shop. Fluorescent buzz, the smell of old leather and citrus cleaner, a hum of radios, a man with a name tag, a glass case of things that have already been surrendered. But if you have ever been to one, you know the particular ache in the way items are displayed. Everything kept within reach, nothing given back easily. Danny called me on the way. He is my nephew, plausible, helpful, the person you call if you need to move a sofa into a storage unit. "Ma, you sure you want me to come?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "If you can stand the smell, bring your patience." He arrived wearing his usual TJ Maxx face, earnest, a little apologetic. He pushed the door open for me like we had agreed on a ritual. Inside, the fluorescent light flattened the colors. A man with ink up to his wrists, yellowed teeth, and a name tag that read Danny greeted us. I pretended not to notice the name tag. I noticed other things. The case was thick with fingerprints, the velvet-lined tray under glass where they keep watches for a better markup, a price tag, the recoil of the clerk's mouth when he knew he had a sale to explain. Danny, the clerk, looked at me with the kind of politeness trained for disputes. "Can I help you?" I put the velvet box on the counter. My hand left a ring mark of coffee and the faint smell of lavender. "Someone sold my husband's Rolex," I said. The words were small. They carried a weight that needed no further adornment. The clerk smiled a practiced smile and slid open the case. The watch I had seen in the couple of grainy photos Mike sent was not there. Instead, there were other faces: a man's duty watch, a woman's thin bracelet watch, a battery-operated thing missing a second hand. He murmured into the receiver at the back of the store. Someone had already moved the Rolex out. "Sold," Danny said, and I felt every inch of the glass case, like a mile between me and what was gone. "Yes." The clerk shrugged, meant to be apologetic, and I felt a rush that was not sadness but a cold spike. "There's paperwork." He pulled out a receipt, a Marlboro paper slip with an address, a buyer's name. The ink smudged in the corner where someone had wiped a nervous thumb. I read the buyer's name aloud, because sometimes the utterance of a fact makes it less dangerous. The name belonged to a small antique buyer a few blocks over, the sort of man who collects things with pockets deep enough not to sweat. "You can buy it back?" Danny asked, hopeful. The clerk was already rubbing something on the watch with a little cloth. He muttered half to himself, and then he frowned. He had the watch to a light. Watches lie to you in bright bulbs sometimes, the way a good polish can put a lie on a thing and make it seem fresh. That was not the case here. The case back of the watch had been opened. Someone had worked on it not with gentle care but with purpose. The man's fingers found a seam, and when he eased the back off, something slid out like a folded wing, a manila envelope, thin, precise. Someone had tucked it into the hollow behind the movement. I watched the man's hands, the way he looked at the paper. He peeled the envelope open with the same solemnity one uses to open a letter from a lover long gone. Inside was a single sheet, Frank's handwriting neat, a code of letters and numbers. The script had that slant that told you it had been written by someone who had always kept a list. SS44 PPSVIN CH81 Don PPDS. I did not understand every letter at first. But then there are moments when puzzle pieces fit like a hinge, and the hinge makes a sound. Danny handed me the envelope without comment. He might be my nephew. He might also be a man who had watched too many families come through his doors. He did not ask for a reward. He watched my face for the kind of movement that tells a person what they should do next. "Is it worth anything?" I asked. The clerk shrugged. Paper is worth more than metal sometimes. He would put it back in inventory. He would list the watch as pre-owned, serviced. A sale would be chalked up. Life and its details file under miscellaneous in the county's books. I put the envelope in my pocket like a relic. We left with the same quiet we had entered with. Danny refused to take the receipt. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need it." Back at home, the house smelled like the lemon-scented cleaner on the counter, and Frank's aftershave that I had not washed off from a sweater. Friday afternoons used to be the time we sat together and did nothing particularly significant. Crosswords, the small accounts of our day. I sat at the table with the envelope. The watch's absence felt like a missing column in an old accounting book. I unfolded the note at the kitchen table because paper deserves to be read where there is light. The code sat on the page like an instruction. Frank always wrote like he was about to hide something. He had the accountant's habit of making everything legible. He hated disarray, even in his secrets. I thought about what the letters could mean. SS Secure Solutions. He always called companies by initials. He liked order, 4457 could be a client number. CH felt like Chicago, where he had done an audit 3 years before our anniversary. Your 8 was feed, August 15th, our wedding anniversary. DS, Dorothy's initials, or something else. The small neurons in my head began to line up like soldiers. Frank had always said that protection is not a thing you buy, it is a system you build. He was an accountant by trade and an architect of security by temperament. He kept lists the way some men keep their prayers. I remembered the times he had mentioned contingencies with a soft, almost affectionate tone. The same tone he used when speaking of our will, of the times he revised his life insurance numbers on a rainy Tuesday. He had always prepared for the possibility that family could get messy. He had never used family as accusation. It was simply one of the angles of risk he measured. I read the code again. SS 457 CH Delta A8B based is. It felt less like nonsense and more like a key. I do not pretend I knew everything about what Frank had done. After 42 years together, you learn the architecture of a person, the beams and the small nails. But there are always things behind walls, and Frank had always been the sort to build secret compartments. I called Mike. He answered on the second ring, as if he were expecting trouble but not truly braced for it. "Mom?" he said, and the way he said "Mom" sounded rehearsed, like someone fitting into a filmed scene. "Where did you sell the watch?" I asked. He hesitated this time. A small pause. "Down on 3rd. Golden relics. It's already gone, Ma. I did what needed to be done." "Why didn't you ask me?" "You'd have told me no. You always say the same thing." I remembered the tedious little grievances of being older, how people assume you are an obstacle. "You always think you know better." He changed tack. "Look, we're going on a trip. Ashley's been working hard. She earned it. By selling what was not yours. It's not like you're—" He started, his mouth filling with something useless. "It's not like you'd want the thing barnacled in a box all the time." My patience with protest had thinned into a sharp shape. "If you think it's about the metal, get the receipts," I said. I wanted to say, "You have no right," but indictments are not always useful against the ones you love. He grew quiet. Voices carry in different ways when you are honest and when you are not. I could hear the hum of a television behind him, a laugh, then a mute clatter. "Ma, I'll talk to you later. We're leaving tomorrow." I hung up. It felt like a breaking. I went to Frank's study. There were notebooks, columns of numbers and niceties in his hand. An unopened letter from the bank lay on the desk, like an abandoned argument. I took it in. There are objects that make you know a person better than conversation ever could. Frank's handwriting was everywhere, marginalia, the small affectionate notes he had left in the sugar jar, 2 spoons, love F, as if he had to sign off on domestic acts. I spread the paper on the desk and let the house breathe around me. The watch was not in the house, but Frank's habit of building redundancy in his life, the extra copies of documents, the secret accounts he would reference with the casualness of a man who had planned for his wife as though she were a corner of the ledger, gave me a thin reed to grip. I started like a child with a puzzle. I wrote the code on a notepad, SS4457 CH0815DS. I circled letters. I made columns. I let Frank's mind, the one that counted toothbrushes and seams, lead me. He had a way of making the private part of care look like good housekeeping. The internet is a classroom for the obsessives. I remember thinking that in the old days, you had to pay an investigator or hurl yourself into libraries. Now a search bar does half the work. I typed SS and then Secure Solutions into the little glowing rectangle he had. A company name popped up, Secure Solutions Investment Management. The address matched the neatness of Frank's handwriting on the envelope. No flamboyance, just a firm that sounded like a safe. A client portal came up. Secure solutions. Client login. The whole idea felt oddly theatrical, like turning a key in a lock you'd been told you didn't have. I wrote down their phone number, which was the kind of detail one keeps in case history decides to bend toward you. There was a FAQ page, dry and indifferent. There was also a notice about offshore accounts and secure trusts, pages with small sections of legalese written to reassure. I used the little sleight of mind Frank had left me. He liked to hide things in plain sight. The letters CH, I thought, could very well be Chicago, where he'd once lectured about tax shelters, and 08/20 might be August 15th. The last two letters, D's, my mind did not immediately place. Dorothy's initials? Possibly. He had a soft habit of naming things after the safe places he loved. I wrote everything down. Patterns are a kind of prayer for those who love order. Numbers and letters started to hum into sense like loose piano strings. That night I slept badly, which is to say I slept in small, careful pieces. I woke to the small urgency of a woman whose husband had been methodical all his life. I made coffee the way we always did, strong, a little bitter, and took it to the table. The envelope waited like a patient witness. There is a peculiar thing about the brain when it is trying to follow footsteps that are not its own. It does not so much create leaps as narrow corridors. You walk them in single file. I will not pretend the logic was linear. It was a string of guesses that fit too comfortably together not to be true. I called a number for a probate lawyer I had used once years ago. Her assistant answered in a soothing voice and said she'd get back to me. Talking to lawyers makes grief feel like something you can measure. I waited for the call. The assistant never rang back that morning. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they thought me another relative with another story. That did nothing to relieve the stiffness in my shoulder. I began to look through Frank's files, like a woman mapping a coastline after a storm. Receipts, bank statements, letters from banks with the blandness of bureaucratic love. Here, a notation that made my heart stutter, a transfer to an entity with the initials SS. The dates matched the client number on the envelope. There was a minor ceremony I performed at that moment, 3 deep breaths, because my hands had started to tremble, and a small, almost childish, sense of victory. I printed the bank statement. Printing things has a way of making them real. The numbers sat on the paper the same way money lays itself down in accounts. Calm, indifferent, durable. The transfer line was small and boring, but it had a destination I could trace. There was also a sheaf of letters in a manila folder marked emergency provisions that I had somehow missed before. I had married a man careful with language and reckless with kindness. A folded list of instructions, not long, just enough to wear a shape. He had not meant for me to find these in any theatrical way. He had always believed the best protection was plain, not ostentatious. That afternoon I told myself I would go to the bank and get answers. I went instead to the library and sat with a book about trust law, because you read the law twice. Once to learn the contours, and the next to see how shadows fit. In the back of the book, there was an index referring to offshore vehicles and the kinds of protections money can be given. It made me think of Frank winding his watch. Turn and store, turn and store. He had turned his resources in ways that made them quiet but present. I called the Secure Solutions office number listed and got a receptionist. She was polite, not suspicious. She asked if I was a client. I said no, and then found myself telling the truth, that my husband had, in his last years, hinted at having arrangements he had never fully explained. That, if they existed, I needed to know because someone had sold his watch, and I feared small cruelties might be a part of a larger pattern. The receptionist put me on hold. There was a recorded message about fiduciary responsibility, soft and confident. When she came back, she asked an odd question. "Do you have a client number?" I did not. I had only a folded piece of paper. "I might have something," I said. "An envelope from a watch." She referred me to an account services number. When I reached an actual person, they asked for a client ID. I read SS4457. The line went quiet in a way that made me catch my breath. The person, unfriendly, in a way that matched the dull, formal clothing of the company, read it back. Let me check. They asked for a last name. I gave mine. They asked for a date of birth and the name of the account holder. I hesitated. What was an account holder if not my late husband? But I gave him Frank's name, and for a moment I felt foolish for having to give his name into a world that had already abstracted him into numbers. There was a delay. I could hear the tense rustle of a keyboard that seemed to suggest someone was actually looking. When the woman returned to the line, she asked if I had any further identifying information. I had the faint memory of a road trip number Frank once used, a kind of inside joke between us about where we met first. I thought of the date that had always been the warmest point in our calendar. The night we met, a small, ordinary date that did not feel like a password until you were trying to open the closed doors someone else had locked. Her voice grew, just slightly, a shade of curiosity. "We do have an account under that client ID," she said. "I'm going to transfer you to the security desk. They handle verification." My heart began to thrum with a careful kind of fear. I had found a hinge. I had found maybe the door Frank had left where one least expects it. "Before I transfer you," the woman added, "I need to tell you, there are protocols for releasing information to non-clients. We'll need proof of authority if you're calling on behalf of someone." Her tone was bureaucratic but not unkind. She was the kind of person who is polite, because politeness is an office policy. I thanked her. I felt suddenly and definitively both very cunning and nearly naive. I had my husband's handwriting and a folded envelope. I had a client ID and the scent of aftershave on my sleeve. I did not have the authority that a bank likes to see, but I had a small plan forming, the way moss forms on stone, gradual, inevitable. That night I lay in the dark and thought about the small things that had signaled something else. Frank's odd focus on locks, his affection for redundancy, the way he had written notes and stowed them in places that felt ludicrously theatrical until the moment you needed them. I thought of the way he had watched the clock face when the world made too much noise. I thought about the way he had smiled when he talked about contingency plans, as if he found them intellectually pleasing and morally decent. Someone once told me that keeping secrets is a sort of love. You do it because you want the person you love to be safe. Frank had kept me safe by other people's reckoning. He had hidden what he could so that hungry hands would not find them first. I did not sleep well that night. I dreamed of small compartments and tiny keys, of the watch tick slowing and speeding, of a man winding something not with his fingers, but with his life. In the early morning, I brewed coffee again and sat at the desk with my notepad. The code on Frank's paper seemed to glow with possibility. I knew, down in the place where grief and stubbornness meet, that there was a decision to be made. Do you pursue the thread or let the world tell you what to do? Do you allow the son who sold the watch to decide the measure of your life? I opened the laptop. The screen lit my face. SS457. Secure Solutions login page stared back like a closed eye, waiting to open. The cursor blinked. I thought of Frank's voice, quiet in the kitchen years earlier, saying, always in that slow, deliberate way, "I set things up so you wouldn't have to worry." I typed the client number. I could feel a pressure like the moment before a letter is sealed. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keys. The world outside had the ordinary morning sounds: a lawnmower, a newspaper hitting a porch, birds with the kind of insistence that says life goes on whether you want it to or not. I had the envelope. I had his handwriting. I had the memory of the date that made his face light up. There was a password here, I was convinced, made from the language of our life. A small, intimate date, a place name, an inside joke. I felt absurdly ridiculous and ferociously sure. My finger moved toward the keys. I thought about what it would mean to look at a number on a screen and find an answer. I thought about justice, which is a long and slow engine, and protection, which is sometimes quiet and sometimes immediate. I placed my hands on the keyboard. Some doors open with a click. Some open with a long-simmered sigh. I pressed the first key. If this is hitting a nerve, if you've ever had someone close take something that felt like a promise, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only one who's learned how to count betrayal like coins. My fingers hovered over the keys until my hands remembered what they'd always known. How to do things thoroughly, how to make numbers tell the truth. I typed what felt less like a password and more like a conversation between two people who had kept their life in code. A small line of text appeared where there had been only the blinking cursor. Then another line, access granted. The words on the screen were absurdly ordinary. They were also a verdict. The page loaded slowly, like a stage curtain shifting. The screen displayed an account summary with columns and dates, the cold ledger-style language Frank had loved. Somewhere near the top was a number, 3 digits that took my breath. 2,919, 334. 12. Not exactly the words miracle or salvation, but the kind of thing you notice like a sugar lump dropped into tea. I stared until my eyes burned. Numbers are not kind or cruel. They are resolute. They do not take your history into account. They simply add and subtract. There were labels on the account: emergency reserve, contingency trust, restricted withdrawal protocol. A file tree offered statements, transfer logs, and an innocuous file labeled for Dorothy, if needed. My hand trembled as if the laptop were a fragile bird. There was a video. It was small, the kind of file you might not expect to find in an investment portal. Frank Cha Video, Final MP4. The file name was the kind of honest thing Frank would use when he wanted to remove every possibility of misunderstanding. I clicked. Frank's face filled the screen. He wore the faded sweater he had favored on cool mornings, the one with the moth near the elbow. He looked older than he was in my memory, and also exactly as he had been, kindly, severe, and private. He started talking as if the camera were a conscionable witness rather than an audience. His hands moved in the little accountant's gestures I knew so well, adjusting an invisible pair of glasses, counting an invisible ledger. "If you're watching this," he said in that soft voice of his, "then something I feared has come to pass." He spoke for nearly 9 minutes. I watched everything he said twice, once with a part of me frozen in disbelief, and again with the part that had been trained to catalog and verify. He explained sources and reasons, the small arithmetic of trust and love. He told me in plain terms that the account was funded from a combination of long-term investments and a series of transfers he had quietly shepherded over years. He called the money "my little fortress," and at one point made a joke about how fortress was perhaps an overly militaristic metaphor for an accountant's miserliness. Then he got to the thing I had been circling on the envelope, the contingency. He spoke of an attempt, he did not say when, to make me legally incapable of managing my affairs, little inquiries and tests by people who should not have been making them. "I always hoped you'd never need to access this account," he said, and there was a smallness in his voice that was as close to shame as he ever allowed himself. "But I built it because love and law are 2 different things. Some people confuse the two." He did not name Mike. He did not have to. He outlined with the cool restraint of a man who had made security a hobby how the funds were to be used, to preserve dignity, to ensure independence, to respond if greed or accident took away what we had built. He mentioned contingencies that included legal retainer funds and steps he'd taken with attorneys to make it difficult, for a simple power of attorney request to rearrange the house. He spoke about recordings, about documentation. He said he had put everything in plain files for me and for the right people to see in case they needed proof. There were practical notes, who to call, where to find certain papers, but mostly there was tenderness. He told me he trusted me and that he had planned because he loved me. He told me to be fierce in my protection of what was ours. He ended by saying what he had always said when sentencing his little directives. Handle it like you handle a good casserole. Steady hands and no shame. When the video ended, my throat was tight with a grief I had not expected. Not only for the man who had died, but for the man who had been obliged to build armor around his love. It felt like discovering a map to a treasure you had always known existed, only to find the map drawn in a hand that weighed every possible loss. The account statements showed transfers in and a long, patient investment history that to anyone else would have looked like prudent retirement planning. To me, it read like evidence of intention. There were notes in the margins that were not part of the bank's upload, memorial phrases he had typed into the file names, tiny things like F no gambling and do not trust quick offers. Frank's little commentary was a voice I could hear across the hum of servers. I printed everything. Printing always is an act of ceremony. It turns the blue light of suspicion into that steady, tangible thing you can put on a table and circle with your finger. I made copies and a folder, labeled it, and sat in the hush of the house, feeling older and more effective than I would have thought possible the week before. There was a slow building nausea to the discovery. This was not simply money. It was the proof that Frank had seen storms I had not. It was proof that people I loved were capable of arranging a hurt like a holiday. It also meant that I had options. The first option was to do nothing and let time and pain have their way. The second was to confront and demand. The third, the one Frank had prepared for, was to gather evidence and let the law do what it was meant for. I thought of the watch in a pawnshop case, the envelope, Mike's unsteady voice. I made the call I should have made sooner. Thomas Chen had the kind of voice that sounds like it belongs to someone who has read novels about cunning but prefers facts. We met in his office, an unobtrusive suite above a laundromat, with framed law enforcement commendations and a photograph of him with a dog. Thomas is the kind of man who takes his shoes seriously. His files were arranged as if he were afraid of crosswinds. He listened to me with the sort of economy Frank was fond of. He did not gasp or patronize. He took the folder and touched the printouts as if they were exhibits. After he had read, he said, "This is more than a family squabble. It reads like a premeditated plan to seize advantage." He said it with the professional detachment of someone who knows how many ways there are to be wrong and how many ways to be careful. We hired him the next day. Thomas was methodical. He obtained pawnshop receipts and tracked the Rolex's path the way some people follow eagles. He pulled public records on transfers and tax liens and interviewed Mr. Torres, the antique buyer who'd purchased the watch. He pulled surveillance footage from the pawnshop and from a convenience store near Mike's apartment. What the footage showed was consistent with the pawnshop records. I do not describe the footage in detail because the specificity of cameras and angles is the kind of technical thing that serves lawyers and not storytellers. Thomas also did what investigators do when they are building a story. He collected the little stray pieces other people toss away. He discovered inquiries into elder wardship filings that had been initiated and then quietly shelved. He found emails to a county clerk about capacity evaluations that had been prompted by someone asking about a non-existent diagnosis. He traced credit card bills that suggested a gambling problem. He documented calls from collection agencies and recorded conversations, legal recordings that had been obtained when consent had been given by one of the parties, and Thomas prepared transcripts. I read them with a feeling like someone listening to a recording from another life, sharply precise, shockingly ordinary. One of the recordings included a paraphrased exchange I remember in skeleton form. Mike's voice, light and trying, saying something like, "If she won't sign, we'll make her sign. She's out of touch." It was the kind of phrase that sounds harmless until you know the context. Another recording, paraphrased, had Ashley saying with the casual cruelty of someone arranging travel plans, "Do it now. Ring up the watch, and we'll be gone before she knows." In the transcribed margins, a note read, "Audible on 312 background laughter." Thomas's notes were careful to explain where things were direct evidence and where they were indicative. He never claimed more than his evidence supported. He did, however, put together a packet that read like a dossier you would hand a lawman. I took the packet to a lawyer Frank had once recommended in an old insurance letter. The lawyer, her name was Marlene, and she had been our bank's friend, the kind of woman who reads policy and then invents a way around its cruelty, took the dossier and made a plan. She called an old associate who had pro bono contacts at the state attorney's office and suggested we put a hold on sudden transfers and get an emergency restraining order against the disposition of assets while the inquiry proceeded. She spoke softly, but like someone who had spent too many evenings over the phone, arguing with people in suits. She also told me to tell Thomas to keep collecting, to look for the house being wired, to check the registrations on certain newly bought cars that appeared on the books but were not ours. When lawyers who represented Mike's interests, Catherine Wells and David Kim, arrived at my house, they carried the kind of confidence law firms buy with glossy brochures. Catherine had a smile, like someone who figured the world could be negotiated, and David had an air like someone who could explain why your position was legally weak. They came to talk about settlement and avoiding family trouble. They wanted a quick arrangement, a temporary power of attorney paper that would let Mike take care of his mother's affairs while things were sorted. I remember the way they sat across from me at my kitchen table, the afternoon light making bars on the formica. Catherine opened a briefcase the way you might open a window in a room that has been stuffy too long. "Mrs. Halpert, it's in everyone's interest to avoid litigation," she said. "A temporary arrangement can smooth things out. We'd propose a limited power of attorney so Mr. Halpert can help with immediate bills, medical, household, until these allegations are resolved." The words, "in everyone's interest," are forgiving words. They can sound kind while being a kind of pressure. I could have signed the paper the way people sign things in supermarkets, without seeing the fine print. In another life, perhaps I would have been coaxed. But Frank had taught me the slow arithmetic of contingency. More importantly, I had seen enough documents and heard enough recordings to know that a temporary arrangement could be a permanent reorganization of one's life. I folded my hands. I thought of the watch in its velvet case, in a glass case 2 neighborhoods away. The man who had bought it with pockets deep and not much small talk. The man's expression when he handed me an envelope and did not want any reward. I thought of Frank's little fortress of funds and the fact that the money in the account could be frozen with a subpoena. I looked at Catherine and David and said, "No." Catherine's smile thinned. "We are only trying to act in the family's best interest." "The family's best interest is to preserve dignity," I said. "If you want to discuss settlements, do it through counsel. Otherwise, leave me to my lawyer." They left with the glossy brochures still pulsing in the briefcase like false hearts. I sat at the table afterward and let the kitchen's familiar odors gather around me. Coffee, lemon cleaner, the faint must of Frank's sweaters. In the quiet, I thought about the nature of coercion, how it appears as help and how it secures power in the name of expediency. Thomas's search enriched itself like a garden in a good season. He found a line of emails between Mike and a local lawyer asking about capacity assessments. He found a creditor's request with dates that fit an odd pattern. He did not call it a crime yet. He called it a pattern. He also discovered that our house had indeed been subject to a recently installed audio system that was never disclosed to me, a system Tom believed had been placed for the convenience of family oversight. Thomas's report put the recordings, the pawn shop trail, and the account statements into a timeline. It read like a slow, ugly narrative. Thomas gave me a copy of the report and told me we had something that could persuade the authorities to look more closely. This is the kind of thing the feds like, he said, because he had worked with agents before. He did not use the word guarantee because he understood that the law is both a blunt instrument and a patient one. A quiet knock came on my door 2 weeks after the account discovery. It was Richard Torres. He held the Rolex in his hand, wrapped in his soft cloth like a returned relic. He had that stoic manner of men who had been soldiers in other lives. He placed the watch on my kitchen table and slid an envelope across the linoleum. "I never should have bought it," he said. His voice had that rusted regret. "I saw the way you looked when you came in, and I didn't want it. I did not know who it belonged to. When I realized—" He shrugged. "I didn't know how to give it back." There was a small, quiet dignity in his movement as he laid the objects down. The Rolex looked smaller than I remembered, but its presence was the same, weighty, unassuming, capable of keeping time even when the heart wanted to refuse it. The band had a faint scratch where someone had wore it every day. There was also something else in the envelope. Richard slid a small SD card across with a shrug that said he had not expected to be entrusted with secrets. He told me frankly what he had found at his shop when he had pried open the case to clean it. The folded envelope, the folded note, but also a thin plastic sleeve tucked behind the movement. Inside that sleeve was an SD card. "I thought you ought to have it," he said, and he walked away as if the matter were done. "Do you?" The SD card contained the kind of thing Frank left when he intended for truth to be simple and stubborn. There were transcripts, audio files, and film notes. There were recordings of meetings where men asked questions about my capacity, and people laughed about the ease of arranging a comfortable housebound life. There were bank screenshots and photos of checks, and a list Frank had called watchful things. The card was, in essence, a backup plan for the backup plan. Thomas and Marlene brought the SD card to a friendly agent they had met in the earlier stages of investigation. The agent, who wore his badge loosely like a promise, listened and then did the thing the law allows in the face of evidence. He convened a team. An inquiry was opened with state authorities, and later, federal interest was expressed in the form of an agent on the phone who spoke with the blunt courtesy of someone who had seen many human dramas and learned to keep them into files. I sat in the kitchen and watched the outside of the house like someone looking through glass at a play assembled without her consent. I did not go outside when the law came. I did not need to. Later, Thomas told me that agents had executed a series of seizures and that certain accounts were frozen pending inquiry. When I asked him about charges, he insisted on cautious language. People had been detained, and interviews had taken place. Certain allegations were under investigation. It was everything I'd hoped for, and nothing like I had imagined. The law moves in its own oblique way, not always satisfying to the impatient heart. There was a moment one morning when I watched 2 men in suits put boxes into the back of a marked vehicle across the street. I made coffee and carried a cup to the window. The steam made a small cloud between me and the curb, where a neighbor had come out to see what the paper said. The world held its breath in small ways. Birds in the hedges, a child playing at the neighbor's stoop, the distant sound of a lawn mower. It was both ordinary and historic. Mike and Ashley were taken in for questioning. The neighbors whispered. People who had smiled in church began to look at the sidewalk in front of my house, as if it had been the site of some small moral earthquake. I received phone calls, some sympathetic, some awkward, that reminded me how small the city can feel when one's neighbors begin to divide themselves into sympathizers and apologists. There was no grand gesture of triumph. There were instead long forms and the patient work of public servants collecting records. Thomas delivered boxes of evidence to the state attorney's office. Marlene drafted motions. I attended a quiet hearing in which the judge froze certain accounts and ordered an accounting. The courtrooms were populated by people who sounded like they had been born in libraries, measured, slightly bored, precise. It was the anti-theatricality of justice. At one hearing in a hallway that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old coffee, I bumped into Melissa, my granddaughter. She had been a figure in the margins of the year's pain, the person who had been drawn toward Mike even as everything else frayed. I had not seen her much since Frank died. She stood there with a look that has always been hers. It is part apology and part apology to be. She reached for my hand, and I let her. "Grandma," she said, and the word was small and earnest. She had on a coat I would have picked for her, blue, deliberate. "I'm sorry." It was a beginning. She told me that she had not known all the ways things had been arranged. She had been with Mike on the trip planning nights, a passenger in a design that felt like rescue. She spoke about regret and not understanding how a small lie can become a life. We sat down on the courthouse steps for 10 minutes and told each other what we could remember. She said with a chastened honesty, "I didn't confront them because I thought, they said you'd be fine." I told her the truth about what Frank had left me, and I felt the old lift of rage that is a kind of fuel. She offered to help, small things at first, running errands, being in the house when lawyers came, making sure that I never had to sign anything without counsel. There was a cautious reconciliation to be had, nothing dramatic, no tearful television moment. But there were lunches and short visits in which she brought me coffee, and we talked about trivial things. Favorite meals, a novel she had recommended, the fact that the hydrangeas were coming in early this year. We both did small acts of repair, the kind that do not erase the past, but make the future less brittle. Richard's SD card also contained a recording that brought a minor legal coup, an exchange in which Mike explicitly discussed the idea of selling the watch and what they would do with the money. The recording, accompanied by the pawnshop receipt, linked the sale to the travel fund. The investigators appreciated the continuity of evidence. They also found, through bank records and Thomas's legwork, the pattern of transfers and the creditors who had been paid sporadically with proceeds that were not fully accounted for. There was a quiet, painful moment when I looked at Mike after a deposition. He looked tired in a way sadness does not explain. He had become a man defined by petty choices. I felt sorrow for the man he might have been. It did not make what he'd done less sharp, but I found that empathy floated like a small raft inside the gulf between us. Mercy and accountability are not the same thing. I had to learn how to hold both without getting lost. When the federal inquiry moved forward, there were forms and interviews, and the clinical efficiency of agents who collect data in order not to be seduced by emotion. The IRS froze certain accounts and requested documentation. The agents were polite in that reserved way of professionals who believe in procedure more than surprise. They did not clap or make speeches. They signed forms and they placed stickers on file folders that would later be entered into evidence. Arrests were made. I will not dramatize the moment because the truth is both simpler and more unsettling. Men went into custody. They were officially charged with offenses consistent with the evidence the investigators had compiled. I watched it unfold through the edges of the legal system I had been pulled into. The community had mixed reactions. Some neighbors were shocked. Some were relieved. Others were awkwardly quiet. I did not feel giddy. There was a long list of practical things to put in order: securing documents, arranging for temporary trustees, removing the invasive devices Thomas had found, changing passwords, notifying social organizations. I delegated as much as I could. There was also a city of small private moments that needed tending. Melissa sat with me on certain nights and read aloud from books Frank loved. We laughed at his old jokes. We mourned the absence of his hands on the neck of a good casserole dish. The hospital visit came as part of a different kind of recovery. Frank had been proud of the volunteer program at the community hospital, where he'd once coordinated finance volunteers. I connected with a woman there who ran the foundation. We talked about what could be done to honor Frank in a way that was both practical and true to what he would have liked. The idea of a small wing, less a palace than a sensible cluster of rooms fitted for dignity, appealed to me. It would be a place for people to wait without feeling like a number, a place where the families who came could at least sit on decent furniture and have a hot cup of coffee without cost. It fit with Frank's dislike of gaudiness and his love of a good quiet fix. The donation process involved lawyers and foundation forms, and the kind of paperwork that has a way of turning charity into a bureaucratic event. Thomas and Marlene guided me through it, because Frank had been a man who wanted things done properly. The plaque we eventually decided upon would read with a simplicity he would have appreciated: the Halpert Family Waiting Room, in honor of Frank Halpert. We discussed wording for weeks because Frank would have liked to get it right. On the day of the small unveiling, I wore Frank's watch. The Rolex sat on my wrist like a small, warm argument. I had had the band adjusted by a jeweler. The catch clicked comfortably against skin that had grown freckled in small ways. People from the hospital staff and a few friends came. The crowd was modest, no more than 20 or 30 folks. Melissa read a short note about the importance of dignity in care. The plaque was screwed into the wooden wall by a contractor whose smile was professional and kind. I spoke for a few minutes, which for me is to say I kept it to 5. I talked about Frank's love of numbers and his conviction that dignity could be arranged if you were willing to spend your time on it. I spoke about the watch that had become the catalyst for an unraveling and then a rebuilding. I did not name every person who had wronged me. I made no gloating gestures. I spoke about responsibility. I said the word forgiveness in a way that felt like a door opened rather than a verdict pronounced. Some people later said I was magnanimous. I do not think of myself that way. I am practical. I like tidy ledgers and honest speech. The donation was, in part, a way to ensure that Frank's energy, his tiny architecting of security, became something that would outlive our private pain and do public good. There were other practical moves. A trust was finalized to protect me from future intrusive filings. A portion of the funds was set aside for Melissa's education. Some was reserved for personal security measures that were sensible rather than theatrical: a better lock, a phone that rings at the right times, a neighbor who agreed to check in. Frank's watchful things were folded into things that would keep me safe without turning my life into a fortress. The SD card, the bank files, and the investigator's reports became a permanent part of the case file. I participated insofar as the law permitted. I gave testimony and handed the agent's documentation. I was no longer simply a woman who had lost a watch. I was a witness to an entire chain of small betrayals. The law is not the only thing that holds people to account. Community memory does too. Friends who had once politely looked away began to call. People brought casseroles. Life resumed with a new circumference. There remained the private work of healing. Melissa and I found a rhythm. Grocery runs, a book club that met at my house on Thursdays, and a small Sunday ritual where we watched old family films and tried to remember Frank's jokes in ways that made laughter easier. I re-engaged my life the way someone relearns to play a piano piece. First hesitantly, then with more confidence. There were days I wore the watch and counted the small minutes like beads, and days I left it in the drawer and let my wrist be bare to feel the light draft that human skin understands. Sometimes, most often at dusk, I stand on the porch, the house settled into its quiet, slow breathing, and wind the watch with the same 2 slow twists Frank had taught me. The motion is only ritual now. It is also promise that time can be taken and also reclaimed. People have asked me if I forgave Mike. Forgiveness is a private ledger. It's not the same as forgetting or absolution. I chose to hold him accountable. The law did what it needed to do. I also chose, in certain small ways, to make space for our family's repair. When he was released on certain conditions pending trial, I set limits: no power of attorney, no access to financial documents, supervised visitations. It was not a sign of cruelty. It was a line in the sand. Melissa and I worked on the fragile possibility of a future that would not erase the past. I do not pretend the transition was easy. There were nights in the beginning when I would wake and reach reflexively for the space near my shoulder, where Frank often slept, and find only the cool surface of the bed. There were moments of loneliness that felt like open windows, but there were also moments of small delight: an orchid that bloomed in January, a neighbor bringing over lemon bars, the way the sunlight slanted over the kitchen counter at 3 in the afternoon and made the knives look like a choir. I began volunteering again at the hospital, not out of grandeur, but because it gave days purpose. I assisted in the small things, helping families fill out forms, making sure the waiting area had warm blankets. There was an immediacy to the work that I liked, a practical, tactile return to usefulness. On the day Melissa and I took down the box of vacation photos that once had been pinned to the dining room table, for the trip that had been planned on the back of a watch sale, we made a small ceremony of it. We took the photographs out one by one. We talked about lines in the pictures, the tilt of a head, the way someone squinted into sunlight. We buried the plan for a holiday, not in bitterness, but in a small laugh about the absurdity of packing lists. There is a scene I imagine sometimes and call a dramatized reconstruction in my head, because memory is a treacherous companion, and I must give it a label when I allow my imagination to smooth edges that were jagged in the moment, dramatized. In that reconstruction, Frank is at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, peering over his glasses at an account ledger, smiling faintly at the cleverness of a man who loved his wife enough to hide her luck in plain sight. He taps the page with a finger and writes, in his neat hand, for Dorothy, if needed. The scene comforts me because it makes his strategy look like tenderness rather than engineering. Real life is less tidy than my dramatizations. There were meetings with the state's attorney, transcripts, attorneys discussing plea negotiations behind closed doors, motions that bound lawyers into a legal prose that was not meant for lay people to parse. The law is a kind of language that takes time to learn. I had to teach myself enough to count my way through it and to listen to those who knew its grammar. Friends have asked me if I ever regretted keeping the watch ritual. They mean, could I have prevented the sale if I had been more possessive, more careful? Perhaps. But I do not live by regret. I live by what is in front of me. The watch, returned to my wrist, is not merely a piece of metal. It is an instrument of memory and of measure. It says that time moves forward, that you can lose things and recover their meaning, and that the human tendency to arraign our lives into stories of right and wrong is a messy but necessary work. As for the headline, how they used my late husband's Rolex for a dream vacation fund, it is factually correct in a small way and morally complicated in a bigger one. They did use the watch as currency to buy a dream, but the dream revealed itself to be an engine of harm. The sale triggered discovery, and discovery triggered accountability. The impulse to take advantage is an engine that sometimes runs on opportunism and sometimes on desperation. I cannot know the precise combination that fueled my son's choice. What I know is the result: a family fractured, an investigation that brought things to light, and an eventual halting repair. In the quieter months that followed, I found the world rearranged by small acts of ordinary courage. Melissa and I planted a row of hydrangeas in the side yard. Thomas came over for Thanksgiving and told a story about a case in which a man had hidden a 1956 muscle car in a garage. We laughed at the ordinariness of human follies. Marlene visited with a casserole and left a note about the usefulness of friends who keep good records. Richard became a steady presence in the neighborhood, a person to be seen nodding with civility, a reminder that not everyone who trafficked in odd things was a villain. There were no public parades, no victorious banners. There was, however, a plaque on a hospital wall and a trust that made sure my name did not disappear into the gusts of opportunism. There was the quiet knowledge that Frank's last plan had protected me in a way no lawyer had promised. Some nights I wind the watch and think of the paradox Frank once described with a wry look. Sometimes the person you think you know is in fact protecting you from the person you love. I know that seems like a riddle, but that's what our lives are. Riddles wrapped in routines. We wind our little mechanisms and keep moving. One evening, months after the raid and the hearings, I sat on the porch with Melissa. The sky had the kind of purple you only see in late July. We talked about small things, what she was studying, whether I might finally sell the lake house or keep it for the summer granddaughters that might come someday. She asked me hesitantly about forgiveness. I told her what I have learned in the arithmetic of being older. Forgiveness is a practice, not an event. It requires boundaries. It requires remembering. "I'm sorry," she said again, with a tenderness that had the rough edges of a first true apology. I reached for her hand and felt, under its softness, the tremor of new resolve. You do not need to be a public figure to find yourself at the center of a story like mine. Small betrayals happen every day. What Frank did, not because he wanted to wage a private war, but because he wanted to preserve dignity, was to make sure there would be choices available to me in a moment of crisis. He gave me options, and with options comes agency. This is not a sermon. It is an old woman's ledger. The debts that were painful, the credits that restored dignity, the small interest of community that made life worth living. It is also a cautionary tale about trust and the quiet ways hurt can accumulate. I have found, in the wake of all this, that the world has more room for second chances if one pairs them with boundaries. There are little rituals I have kept. Thursday book club, hospital volunteering, counting the stitches in a good casserole crust, the way Frank counted columns in a ledger. There are also rituals I have invented, a small weekly check-in with Melissa, a day when I go through the trust paperwork just to make sure the details are right, and the quiet practice of winding the watch each evening at sundown. The watch sits on my wrist now more often than not. Its tick is a companion. It does not erase loss. It does not remove the memory of a velvet box once empty on my kitchen counter. But it has a new meaning, one made of protection, proof, and the stubborn insistence of a life continued. If anything in this story rings with you, if you've ever found yourself betrayed by someone close, please share this video with someone who needs it. Tell your story in the comments. There is comfort in the small community of those who have learned to keep watch. I close with what Frank said in that quiet video. Protection is a thing you build, little by little. He taught me that love can be both tenderness and strategy. I wear his watch now the way I keep his memory, carefully, with an eye toward justice and a hand toward mercy. Time keeps moving, and we keep making choices with it. The watch marks those choices. It keeps time, and in doing so, it reminds me to keep living.